Hello and welcome. My name is Trismegistus, and today we're going to be reading through and inserting the latest Factorio Friday Facts. Friday Facts 419. Display panel and inserter pickup fixes. Posted by Arundel, Clonan and Twinson. Hello, welcome to our facts for the week. Signposts or bulletin boards are a common sight in video games, probably not far behind the ubiquitous wooden crate or explosive barrel. They are a nice, clean, understandable way to communicate with the player, and it was something we wanted to see in Factorio for a long time. Display panel. Design. By Arundel. The full functionality of the new display entity will be fully explained further below. For the design, all we need to know is that it is an entity that can display any icon of your choice, be that an item, a recipe, or a virtual signal. The first version I saw was a signpost added by Clonan. It was a nice placeholder, and the general concept of the display entity as a signpost was something to consider. In theory, a signpost could work, but there are a few detracting factors. Firstly, a signpost is primarily a 2D structure, and by that I mean it is tall and flat but doesn't have much depth. If the signpost supporting post is in the middle of the tile, then, as a tallish entity, that pushes the display area up and outside of the tile that the entity occupies. So just jumping to the picture to kind of explain that, the point that Arundel is making is that if the signpost is sat in the middle of a tile, so the actual post of the signpost is sat in the very middle of the tile, so that'd be where the sort of coil is for the light, for example, in the light entity, then because the signpost has to be a post, it would be a little weird if it was just sort of sat on the floor. Because it has to be a post, then that means it needs to be quite tall. And so the actual signpost part, the sign part of the signpost, is then above the tile that you've placed it on. So in other words, it sort of pushes out past the tile that you've put the actual signpost on. Now obviously they could have shrunk it down, for example, or as they gone with a very small signpost, but then it'd start to look maybe a bit strange, because if it's too small, you can't really display the entities you want on it. If it's a very short post for the signpost, then it maybe looks like a side of a wooden box or something like that, so it starts to look a little strange. Not the mental image that we all have of a signpost. Secondly, if the signpost is moved forwards so that the display keeps more within the entity tile, then, as a mostly 2D structure, it looks like most of the tile behind it is unoccupied, and it looks weird when lined up with other things. Again, referring to the diagram to explain that a little bit, the point is that if you then say, right, well, I don't want it overlapping into the tile above, I don't want the sign part of the signpost overlapping, then I might move the post part forward. And so the post is then sat at the front of the tile. So for example, on the light here, you might say that the post is aligned with the bottom of the light entity there, and so the sign itself moves up, and then the actual sign would sort of fit more within the actual tile, keeping the entity within that single tile and not having any overlap problems. The point Arundel's making is that if you do that, then it starts to feel like, in a way, the signpost is actually in the tile in front, and therefore it looks like the entire tile behind it is completely empty. And so you might get some odd behaviour. An example might be that you would put a signpost down and you would feel that you would be able to put a light behind it, but you wouldn't be able to, because actually it does occupy the tile. It just leaves most of the tile empty because it's been pushed forward in the tile. So if you imagine a light on the side here of each side of the signpost, the first point that he makes is related to the fact that it pushes up way past the light, so the light would be kind of there and the top of it would be poking out. But if you then move it forward, like in the second point, it looks like the entire thing is empty, essentially. This is an empty tile, and that could be a bit confusing and look a bit weird, essentially. Thirdly, the display surface ends up as a vertical rectangle. But the icons that appear on the display are icons that are designed to be seen either in a GUI or on a horizontal plane like the ground or a transport bell. This would make all the icons look more out of place and fight against Factorio's apparent camera projection. So that's a little bit complicated in the way it's explained, but the basic point is fairly simple, in that they've designed all of their icons so that when you pop a GUI up, it looks right. When these items as icons in the GUI, you pop up your crafting menu or inventory or anything like that, the icons look right. And of course, that's a projection of an item on the surface. We're coming back, we mentioned this in a few Friday Facts, we're coming back to this fact that the perspective that's given to everything in Factorio is like forced. It wouldn't look like that if you were looking down at the angle we're apparently looking at, because it's not actually, I can't remember what the proper terms are, whether it's orthogonal or what have you, but basically it's kind of looking like everything is meant to have perspective, but the way you see it's completely flat. There is no depth in a sense, even though there is, because it's being shown in that way. But you have to think of the game as a flat 2D plane, and then everything is like just being presented as if it's at an angle. There is no height. The way they've done the elevated rails, for example, is essentially to fake it. The rail pieces are actually sat on the tile you'd expect them to be sat on, but then they're sort of drawn 3 tiles above. It's a faked height, basically, because that's the only way they can do it, because it's not a 3D game. So the basic point is that they're designed to look good in a GUI, and they're designed to look good as they move around on transport belts, which of course are meant to be flat on the game, with this odd projection that they have to do in order to make it look 3D. So if you then say, right, well, this is an item that we've drawn as if it's meant to be flat on a belt on a surface, and then you put that exact item on a panel that's like that, you get this very weird projection effect being doubled up, essentially. And although it would probably look okay in terms of the icon itself, the icon is fine, but because what you're expecting as a player to see, because it's a vertical board, doesn't make sense, and so it starts to look very strange, essentially, is the point. What you're expecting is that this is a vertical sign, but they're putting horizontally projected items onto it. So in other words, if the sign was just laying on the floor, then the icons would work. But imagine that, shifted up so that it's facing you, and your brain would go, what? What's going on there? And I say it's all fake because it's just drawn to represent it. But that is obviously a bit jarring and a bit of a strange way to do things. If any version of a signpost was going to work, then it would probably need to be more like one of those temporary road signs that sits on the ground and leans back on some triangular support struts. The bigger problem is that neither of these options has the right aesthetic. So that's one of those that, if you imagine it from the side, you've got basically, legs out the back, essentially. So if that's the sign itself, then it'll have some legs out the back, so that it's got legs at the front and legs at the back, and it's doing that. And therefore, the actual projection that you're seeing, the bit you're looking at, is actually an angle already, and so when you to draw that, it would fit better with the projection. Again, it would be all weird perspective, really, in real life sort of thing, but it's more in line with what you're expecting to see and how it would look. But the real point here, where the real conclusion, is that a wooden sign and some temporary sign just aren't very Factorio. They're fine in and of themselves, but they're not really in that aesthetic style that Factorio has, of the diesel punk, kit bashed together, bits and pieces stuck together, a type of aesthetic that Factorio has. And what's coming up, what the result of the work is looks really, really good, actually. First design, display plate. My first design was a quick mock-up of something that would fix a lot of these problems. It would be a broad, blocky, mostly horizontal display surface that would work more naturally with the icons we have. It's more akin to a metal display plaque that you might see in an old industrial museum or war memorial. The next problem is that if the icon were drawn on the surface, then really it should be squashed in the vertical axis a bit because of the camera direction. To avoid this, I tipped the surface forward slightly to face the camera. A lot of display plates are angled towards the expected head position of a standing reader, so this looked reasonable. So the thing I would compare this to is the memorial thing. If you've ever been to like a historical building, or war memorials are quite a good example, where there'll be a plaque on the memorial somewhere, or maybe there's a garden, a memorial garden, and there'll be a plaque somewhere. And typically, one of the ways that plaque might be displayed would be on an angled plinth. And the idea being then that you have to account essentially for people's different heights. So a child needs to be able to read the plaque, and a 6'6" tall adult needs to be able to read the plaque. So if you have it at an angle, then everyone is just looking down on it, but also it's not too difficult to read. If it's flat and it was low down, then someone high up would have difficulty reading it. Whereas if it's, say, flat, so horizontal, then or high up or something like that, then a small child would have difficulty reading it. So if you have it fairly low down but angle it, then anyone can view it pretty much at any angle. And what we're going to see here is like modelled on that essentially. So you have to think of this as a plaque that's on an angle, like that, rather than flat, rather than vertical, or rather than horizontal. The final thing was that the icons tended to look best and be clear on a dark grey background, so that was added too. That's about as far as I got with that idea. It wasn't intended to be a proper design and wasn't done at the usual 4x resolution of concept art. Even so, it worked better than the signpost, so it was put into the game for a few months. It even managed to sneak its way into a few Friday Facts. So this is it in the images here. This is what we saw in the... I don't remember seeing it in a Friday Facts. If you know which Friday Facts Arendura is referring to, let me know. But I'll bring it up in a moment. But we've got the actual image on the Steam page. And that's got one on. And that was the thing with the weird icon that I was completely lost by. And essentially it's one of these. Now what's particularly interesting about these, I know this was like a temporary solution in a sense, but there are different variants going on here. My assumption is that the background can be changed, that this isn't automatically being set, so that you can pick the colour essentially. Now whether it's the full colour picker, I don't know, or if it's a limited set of options. And I have zoomed in on these and I can't tell what's written on them. I don't know if that's just conceptual, it's just a figurative thing, because it actually looks like it's the same text being repeated, so I think it's not real text from the game, it's just kind of showing the concept. And I think also maybe if it was used to show text, as we'll come on to later, then perhaps it just showed this generic picture and then the actual text was available via hover over, so that not getting too complicated with how it was programmed, because if you're adding it on dynamically onto the surface, then that would be a bit more difficult to do. But yeah, so this, you have to think it's bigger at the back than it is at the front, basically, is the idea, like a plinth, and then you've got all sorts of different variations. I actually think it looks really good. I would quite like to see this in the game anyway. I think the next one we're coming on to, which you can actually see poking out at the bottom here, is even better, and I kind of really, really like it. But having plinths like this, or something like that in the game anyway, would be pretty awesome, I think. And it feels like something a mod could quite easily put in, because really this is getting into territory of... It's getting very similar to the territory of a mod, and I think that mod is called Display Plates, where you can actually put down text basically on an actual sort of thing. But this like plinth design and having something like this would be even more awesome. I think this is a concept that a mod could really run with, I think. So I did just want to zoom in on a bit more. As I say, I can't tell what this text says, if it says anything. I doubt very much it does. I think it's just, because it's repeated basically, I think it's just conceptual as to what it is. But if you look at this thing, this is the thing we saw in the last Friday Facts / Steam page. And the one specifically is this one. In particular down on the right here, so I'll just zoom in on that. So yeah, so this thing in the middle of the picture here is basically the plinth. I still don't know what's being displayed on it, if I'm totally honest. It's similar to like a nuclear power plant or something like that, but it isn't those objects. It's similar to what the original concept was for the ground station, even though this appears to be what the ground station is. So yeah, so I'm wondering if this is actually an old icon as well, or perhaps it is some building that we don't know about. There's speculation that maybe we are getting a new source of power, plutonium based, and maybe this is the plutonium reactor rather than the uranium reactor. So I think this is an icon representing a building we don't know yet, but it's good to know that what this is. I still think, as I say, that having this in the game would be pretty cool. I think being able to stick these icons on would be pretty awesome. Second design. More circuits. When the time came to do the proper design, some of the requirements had changed. It was no longer just a static display. It had circuit connectivity to change the icon, and more. It was also unlocked later as part of the circuit network system, along with all the combinators, the power switch, and the programmable speaker. As such, the new display entity should look like it was part of that level of technology. The new design is based on the combinator style base. All of the combinators are different, so the base of the display is also the same but different, in a consistent sort of way. That's a very convoluted way of saying basically it's like similar rather than the same. So each of the combinators does look different, otherwise you'd get them all mixed up and confused, so they look a bit different, but they have a style. They're similar but different is the point, and so this is similar but different. And here we see it. So this image here has 4 concept sketches, essentially. I'm going to zoom in a second, but we're going to basically get 3 sets of these. We'll get a very black and white, literally, I assume, hand-drawn by pencil type image. There's then a sort of a coloured-in version of that, and then a final one that looks like that's been mocked up more, perhaps in Photoshop or something like that. So it's got a bit more sort of painted style to it, essentially. So let's have a zoom in on the first set then. These are the sketch versions, and I mean, straight away it looks awesome, basically. I mean, Arundel really nails the Factorio style. This does look like something that the engineer would kit bash together, and it's got that cables running around just because cables need to run around. They're not hidden or what have you, because the engineer is trying to get the job done rather than worrying too much about aesthetics. And so it comes up with a very consistent style, basically. There's a couple of really nice little touches on these. I love this gear on the front. It's actually gone in later versions, but I love the little gear on the front. It's almost the sort of nod back to the Factorio gear, isn't it? This is, and it's going to explain it, but it's cathode ray tube, which is, I imagine young people don't, they've never even kind of encountered a CRT anymore, cathode ray tube, but it's basically an older display technology where essentially an electron beam would scan across the surface of the image, and so it built it up pixel by pixel. But that then lends itself to a particular look to the thing. It has a kind of a angled back to it, unlike the flat panels we all use today. CRTs have that sort of shape where their back of them is like angled, because obviously if it's an electron beam it's got to scan across, so it can't be it's got to follow that path. But then also the front was always curved as well, because I say you need a kind of consistent distance for the beam to travel, essentially, was one of the things. But anyway, it's getting way off on the detail. So this is one of the things you get on the actual combinators as well, but it's kind of emphasised here. These are the connection points for the circuit network, so the red and green wires. And they actually look like you would screw, so there's like a coax cable where you would attach it and then screw it on, or any kind of cable connection where you got that. And that's the engineer, ensuring that it's properly attached and, it's a proper connection, basically. But they do look like great big coax cable connectors, and, it's got an actual sort of solid piece of copper sticking out, and then the connector where you screw it on. It's a very evocative piece of imagery, really. For the display face itself, I went with a CRT, cathode ray tube. This sort of curved display surface is ideal for the aesthetic of that part of the tech tree. A screen of this sort is normally angled forward, but if you look at a lot of old NASA displays, a lot of them were angled quite heavily upward. So by forward it means, it's flat, basically. You would normally watch a TV when you sat down, you're watching your TV, so the display itself is like that. But in control rooms, like the NASA control rooms, they would be set at an angle, because then an operator can sit and look at the screen, but then also when they're stood up they can see the screen as well. It comes back to that same point about it being a plinth, essentially, that any angle you can then kind of see it. Presumably this is so that they can be seen well from a sitting or standing position. For reasons mentioned earlier, it's best for our icons if the display surface is closer to facing the camera, which is a 45-degree angle. The CRT screen is angled up at about 40 degrees, so it's nearly facing the screen, but you can still see some of the interesting details from the top. So by that is referring to this part here. If it was exactly 45 degrees, then it would be all of the detail that was behind it, that angled back to the CRT that I was talking about, would be completely hidden, because it would all be curving in like that, basically. So if you angle it ever so slightly like that, then you can kind of see the top part of the, the angled part. So, and also that, connecting wire at the back is there as well. So zooming in on this then, they're pretty much the same things. If we flip between them, this is just a kind of coloured in version essentially, but it's still retaining the sort of hand-drawn aesthetic to it, and it's still got the cog, it's still got the thing, because it looks to me, that looks like a tuning dial. That's one of the reasons I quite like it, and why it links well to the Factorio logo. It feels like a dial the engineer would be using to tune in, because you're getting back into the analog days of communication, where you had to search for signals and tune into a channel and all that sort of stuff. You still have to do that, but they're digital channels nowadays. But yeah, again, just looks really great. The first iteration of the new design was based on the whole structure rotating without changing its form per direction. This made the screen move around based on the entity orientation, which is more consistent for that shape of object, but it wasn't great to have the icon and text be shifted to the left or right, so that had to change. What that's basically saying is you can actually see it. If we go back to the blown up version, if you look at where this screen is, it's moving relative to the other versions essentially. So if you imagine you're hitting R key and it's rotating round, this display is moving about. Now the idea is that the engineer is rotating the screen, so they rotate the entity and then they rotate the screen to compensate for that rotation. And if you think about it, unless it was some weird, I don't think you could even achieve it, but unless it was like absolutely dead central to that point, as you rotated it, say it's offset slightly, that offset moves basically. So if it's offset by, say that's the center of the thing and the center of the screen is offset slightly, as you move it round, the offset is going to change basically. So where the actual screen is moves as it moves around. So it's realistic if you do that. But the point is, it's a bit confusing for the player because they're having to look around as it moves around, and it's not being consistent with where it is in the frame, essentially in the thing. The second iteration keeps the screen steady through all the rotations. This means that the shape of the structure is different for each rotation, and it was a bit of a struggle to keep the circuit connection points in reasonable places, but it worked out. Okay, so this is this last one here, and as you can see, comparing the two, that's pretty much the same. Now where we had the screen off to the sort of top left of the, compare it to the square, come up to the top left of the square, it's now exactly where it was from before. Now here it moves so that it's kind of off the top of the square, and it's exactly the same as where it was before. And here it's to the right of the square, top right of the square, and now it's the same. So as you rotate this icon around, this entity around, the actual screen will stay exactly where it is. Now that does technically mean, and I think this is actually sort of true with quite a lot of the entities in the game, they're not actual rotations of the object. They are slightly different designs in order that certain things are kept in the same place, basically. Because you as a player, like pipe connections and stuff like that, they're kind of skewed and like shifted slightly from where they would actually be, partly because of the projection that they do, but also because of they need you as a player to know exactly where those things are going to be, not have them slightly shifting and offset because you're just simply rotating it around. The other point Arundel makes is that fitting in the wire connections, so the circuit connection things, was obviously more different. So if we zoom right in, the cog is gone, which is a shame. Maybe it's now a trackball or something like that, but or just a big button for the engineer to press. But yeah, so it's the same sort of conceptual idea. As it rotates round, we now just have the screen in the same place. As I've said in multiple Friday Facts, I really, really like the design of Factorio. But I also always appreciate that it's not quite for everyone. It's a bit dingy and dark and diesel punk. But I really, really love it. To me, it's very reminiscent of. There's all sorts of kinds of influences on it. But there's like, if you think about the original Alien, where it's that sci-fi but worn out sci-fi. Sci-fi that, it's futuristic, but it's been used for dozens, if not hundreds, or, maybe not thousands, but it's been used for a long time, so it's grimy and it's a bit broken and it's a bit old, as it were. The other thing it always evokes for me is like the Akira, but it is consistent. So there's a lot of cyberpunk. You have these conduits and wires and cooling ducts and all that sort of stuff that are exposed. It's very postmodern design, very much functional over aesthetic, and that's the other thing it always evokes for me is the whole big cables that connect together and cable runs and wires in bundles and all that sort of stuff that is very 1980s version of the future. We could have locked it to just one rotation, but having rotatable circuit connections is pretty important because this is one of the few display-focused entities in the game, and having wires covering the icon is not what you want. Rotating the entity to change the circuit connection positions helps keep the screen clear. Even if you rotate it as part of a larger combinator bank, they all rotate together and stop the wires from tangling. Also, even the constant combinator has 4 rotations, so it would be weird if this display panel only had 1. This design is pretty new, so we'll need to test it more before calling it final. There's no 3D model yet. That will be made if we decide that we're happy with this version. Display panel functionality. By Clonan, the display panel at its most core and simplest is just a way to show messages to players, so that was the natural first feature. Showing messages. In the display panel GUI, players can type a message to be shown. By default, the message is only visible when the display panel is hovered over by the player. So we've got 2 comparisons here. The basic point is that it's all very well just showing the icon, that's fine, but what this is for is to do communication. It's almost like, and they'll go on to explain it a bit, it's like an enhanced version of tagging, the map tags, where you can actually put messages and information in. They're kind of making several mods redundant here. As I say, there is the display panel one, the signs and that sort of thing. I still think those would have quite a lot of use, but it's kind of making those a bit extra to the functionality that it already has. But then also it's kind of making things like to-do list and note type mods basically a bit redundant because this functionality will be in the game. To dive into why I think this is kind of been added, because it's a nice aesthetic thing and all that sort of stuff, but I think this is partly driven by multiplayer, needing to communicate between multiple players, especially those without headphones and what have you, or lots of players on the same game. But also I think another part to it is we're going to be playing across 5 different surfaces, 5 different planets and platforms. There are going to be a lot of things where you need to leave yourself notes. You're going to come back to a part of the map, a part of the game, one of the planets where you've not touched it in a long time, and you will not have a clue what the pressing thing that you needed to do was when you had to go and do something else. There's just too many balls to juggle, I think. And so having functionality where you can leave yourself notes or leave messages to other people or what have you is kind of the real reason for having this. And the way it's going to work, essentially, as it shows on these side-by-side pictures, is that you will have the actual entity itself, and you're obviously able to display icons and what have you on it. But then if you hover over, in the usual way, it'll pop up the message that you've written, essentially. So we've just got the ghost here and the ghost saying boo. Sometimes, though, we want the information to be visible at all times. So we added an option to set the text to always show in alt mode. So, and this next picture just shows that. Basically, if you switch on alt mode, then you have the option to, I presume this is per display thing, have it show all the time or just show when you hover over, basically. So if you've got alt mode on, I say they can be on all the time or just when you hover over them. For short messages, this is okay, but we can't just spam whole paragraphs on the player screen all the time. So we made it that only the first line of text will show, and the full message appears only when hovered. So here they're just showing that basically the 2 options. This is the first line of the message that's been written, and it's just always on the screen, so modules don't touch. If you hover over, you get the rest of the message, which reads, "Every time I come back to base, all the modules are gone. Seriously, stop stealing them. It's beyond frustrating. I put them in a chest for a reason." I think that's nice. I do wonder, though, when it says the first line, how is it drawing the... Because to me, there's a bit of a possibility of just trolling with this, because if you're using the first carriage return, so the first point where it breaks to a new paragraph, I could write 10,000 words and not hit, a paragraph, basically. So I could just put on, and I could do, you could do all sorts of things of making it just a continuous line of, without any spaces, or just, like vertical, just single, just runs all the way down the screen. And you could put text after, just continuous text that it was staggeringly annoying. And you could set that to be, always displayed. And then when the player had alt mode on, and I think most players know to play with alt mode on, that would just, be a troll, basically. Now, obviously, they could then go in and set it off. They could turn that off or edit the message or what have you. But then you're talking about basically, trolling that other person, because you're having to force them to do something to fix it. So I don't know. I'd rather it was limited to a character length. So the first 150 characters or something were also the limit. So it's not just the first carriage return. Showing icons. Next, it felt natural that we allow the player to set an icon to show. It doesn't really need any explanation. You pick an icon and it's drawn on the entity. Except we took it a step further with the show in chart option, which takes the usage of the display panel to the next level. And here this is shown in two images. We have the display panel itself on the left, where we have two options shown: always show, which is the one we were just talking about, and show in chart, with the hover over saying show the chosen icon and the first line of text on the map chart. The first line of text being barrel plant, and the second line of text being input on the left, output on the right. So the bit that will appear is the barrel plant. It also shows the icon itself. The right hand image then is showing the map view, and we can just see that barrel and barrel plant being the text there. Clicking the icon on the map opens the signpost for easy editing. This is quite similar to the custom tag system, but doesn't need any manual management when you add or remove part of your factory. And of course, Coverix made it work with the new parameterized blueprints, so stamping down a standard design will have the display panel with the correct icon with perfect alignment. This is just shown in the next image when it says standard design. So if you're not familiar, there is a parameterized system coming where basically you can have generic things in your blueprints, and then you can set those either dynamically via the circuit network, or the player can just adjust them. And that's what we see here. These blocks are identical. Okay, there's two types. There's a longer one and a shorter one, but the actual entities, the belts, what these are in terms of the build are identical. And clearly these have been set up so that they can adjust to the recipe that they want. And the inclusion of the display thing means that it can also be then automatically displayed. So if you stamp one of these down and there's maybe a combinator, or maybe it can feed it off of the display itself, but you then basically set it and say, right, I want to produce rocket turrets, I want to produce green assemblers. You do that once and it shows it, on the display icon, as well as setting all of the recipes. Because of the parameterized system, it does all of the what things need to be type approach, as in what it needs in terms of ingredients, be that gears or iron plate or steel or what have you. And so it then just sets that all up for you. And the key thing here is that's part of the blueprint. So this is the way we're getting map tagging from blueprints, or with blueprints, basically. So what you would currently have to do is use tags, or you could use the pins, I guess. It's a very similar system, but you have to use the tags and say, right, this is where I'm making green science. This is where I'm making rocket turrets. This is where I'm making, we got quality modules. You have to do that at the moment, okay? And usual Factorio way, they've automated it. So you don't even have to go and set tags anymore. You can just have it. I mean, you probably have to set what the recipe is for the thing. You have to tell it what to build, although I'm sure with fancy circuit networks, actually, you could automate that as well. But basically, you then set that, and it just pops up on the display what it's, on the map, what the display icon is, because you've just set it once. And the point really is if you delete that area, if you move it, you cut and paste it, what have you, you put more of them down, it automatically puts them on the map. Now, of course, you do have the option, you can show the icons, of the actual buildings on the map, so you've got other ways of doing this. But that can obviously get a bit busy. If all you want to know is where am I making gun turrets, you don't really want to see all the other icons of, gears and what have you being made. So just having it automatically do it is a really nice little touch. It also then makes it for all the people with sort of OCD and stuff. It's obviously going to be exactly the same place if you're using exactly the same blueprint. So it'll all be nicely aligned and exactly the right position, etc. And you can also accompany it with various notes, you can put those on as well. And one of the things this has that obviously tagging doesn't is the multiple lines thing. Because in tags at the moment, you can just put one sentence in, basically. Whereas this allows you to put some proper explanation. You can put a bit of detail. When it's got a to-do item, you can have the to-do be build more iron, but then you can have notes under it saying, right, I need 4 more iron smelting arrays, and that means I need to get 4 more outposts, and da-da-da-da-da. So you can have it a bit more like the to-do list, basically. Connecting to the circuit network. Connecting the display panel to the circuit network opens a whole can of worms. Initially, we didn't know how to do it, because entering text with the circuit network isn't something that can be done. So we decided on a simple system. Firstly, you can specify a list of messages, each with its own condition. Secondly, the list is evaluated top to bottom. You can drag or rearrange them. And lastly, the first message that passes its condition is shown. Okay, so this is where things get a bit complicated in terms of the usage of the thing, because everything up till now is sort of a repeat of things we've already got. We've got map tagging, we've got the ability to write on the map with the tags, we've got, they've given us the ability to move tags around, and we can always delete them and obviously stuff like that. And pinning is a different version of that. So we've sort of, got the things we've got, and there are mods that can do display panels and things like that. So a lot of what we've seen is kind of just bringing mods and that into the game, giving a bit of refinement, etc., etc. This is where we get into proper functionality additions. Okay. Now the point is that you cannot currently set text in the circuit network. You can't have a message as such that flashes up. I think you can do something similar with the speakers. You can certainly have them trigger on different conditions, and that's kind of what this is introducing. So the idea is, to be honest, this is actually getting into the whole thing of the circuit network becoming a bit more like proper programming, because this could be thought of as either a nested if or perhaps a case statement. And the idea with those programming techniques is basically you set a series of conditions where it's a bit more subtle than a basic binary condition. So if you're not familiar, there's something called an if statement, and it's a type of Boolean logic where it can either be true or it can be false. Okay, it can be null as well. But if you set a condition, and looking at the picture that's shown, really good example is shown on each of these, in that the first condition that's being tested here is whether iron is below 1,000. So that less than, I'm going to explain this, I'm sure if you've used the circuit network, you've done a lot of stuff, you know how this works in the game. But if you're not familiar with it at all, then this is kind of the type of logic you can do in Factorio at the moment, but this is kind of extending it further. So what they're trying to check is whether iron plates, is less than 1,000. It's a warning system. It's saying you've not got any iron plates in your base. Okay, that's what you're trying to test for. And so the less than symbol is saying that whatever signal is being fed in, and remember now in a lot of circuit network stuff we can have sight of what signals are coming in, but basically it's filtering whatever's coming in to iron. So this is a condition that applies for iron, and then this is the signal that's coming in. Okay, the red wire, because it's connected to the roboport, which is able to interrogate the logistics network, it's saying, right, you have got 92,000 iron plates in your base. Okay, so that condition is therefore not true. 92,000 is not less than 1,000, so this condition is null. This is a false return. Okay. Next one then, same warning message, and you can edit this warning message, you see. This is the functionality it's really giving us, to say copper low. And it's a very similar test where we've got 132,000 and we want to get a warning if it goes below 1,000. And as I say, you can sort of do this with the warning things, but it doesn't, I think, it's not as complicated or as detailed as this. I don't think you can do nested ones either, which is the real improvement to me. The next one is plastic then. Plastic low. Is 28,000 below 1,000? No, so everything's okay. Now, as I say, this would be sort of a nested if thing going on, okay? Where it gets into more sort of case type statement, and a case is where you can have lots of different cases, which could be true. So in other words, it's a whole load of ifs that are happening at the same time, is that if none of these are true, okay, then it'll do this test, or I think it could have a default, basically. So what you could do is you could, everything is okay. I think you could probably not have a condition on it, because the point is from this list as it's described, it will check these in order, and it will only display the one that it hits first. Okay, so if your priority is iron plate, you put that first in the list. If your second priority is copper, third priority is plastic, everything else you don't care about, so then it will display the everything is okay. And as I say, I don't think you probably need this condition. It will just default to this when these are passed, but if one of them becomes true, so suddenly all the copper goes, platform turns up, all your copper goes into space, suddenly that's true, and it stops at that point and tells you the copper low condition. And until that becomes false, until you've got more copper, it will keep telling you the copper is low. If suddenly iron becomes low, it will switch to telling you that, because that's your priority. And as I say, even though the everything symbol is being used here, and the everything is just set to if there is stuff, basically. If everything is above 0, or is that anything? I can't remember if that's, I can never remember the red, which is everything, which is anything, which is each or what have you. I can't remember those conditions. They're just not in my head. But basically this is like the default thing. So if none of these are passed, it will basically always fire that up. Now that probably may not sound all that spectacular, but you haven't really been able to do this properly in Factorio without massive banks of combinators. And this, this is a point I've harped on before, but so I won't really repeat it in too much detail. But this was always my problem with the system. I want to be able to do things like this. I would love to be able to put these sorts of smarts in, and I can do it. It's just that it requires an awful lot of messing about, when really I just want to be able to write a case statement or a set of nested ifs, and this is what this is. Yeah, it's a visual way of showing that type of programming, which means that me, who knows how to do it but cannot be bothered to mess about with a million combinators, and I'm sure there's smarter ways of doing it, but I just want to be able to set this up. Nice logical thing, tells me what my key priority is for for the next stage of the growing the base. Done, and it's there and it's dynamic, and I don't have to place down and work out and connect with wires hundreds of obviously it wouldn't be hundreds, but dozens of combinators. You can obviously still do that, but this is stopping people like me getting quite frustrated with the system, basically. We also added the functionality of using the any signal as a wildcard for setting the icon, so you can make dynamic combinator displays. So we have the new green combinator, the one that allows us to do various listing types, and these are clearly set in such a way that they're giving different outputs from whatever's being fed in. Again, it's connected to a roboport, which is presumably reading the logistics network, and then these are all chained together with presumably this outputting, say, the most, the second most, the third most, the fourth most, the fifth most, the sixth most, something like that, and then outputting that via red wire to this display. And then because this is set to say, right, what have I got most of? What have I got the second most of? What have I got the third most of? All it's outputting is a single item, and by using the any signal, turns out that was anything, but doing it without any kind of message, so this is no label, it's blank, means that it will display the icon of whatever it's being passed, and therefore you can nicely see. At the moment, in order to do this, you have to hover over the combinator, and one of the problems with that I always find is that because signals get all mixed together and you might have lots of different things coming from lots of different things, it can be a bit difficult to tell exactly what's being output and input. And so by having this display thing, you can get it to automatically query that, or not automatically, get it to display the thing that you want it to display. So if it was a list, you could set this with all sorts of conditions. You could say anything that was above 10 and show that as the icon that's being displayed there. And then you can use it for diagnosing, oh, well, we've got way too much copper or something. We need to process the copper, or if you're on Volcanus, dump it into the lava, or chuck it overboard if you're on a spaceship, space platform rather. So this is adding informational power, basically. It's not about necessarily giving us extra functionality. It's about being able to get information out of the system. And you've got to remember, with Space Age, we are getting, dozens, maybe hundreds of new items and recipes and all sorts of things. And even at the moment, it is very confusing sometimes to see all of these items in your logistics network and know what's going on. And I say, we're getting, every planet has got its own resources, it's got its own intermediates, it's got its own buildings that it makes, it's got its own unique recipes. So there is just so much information now that having more tools to manage and understand that information is going to be vital. Now, I don't think, you can obviously apply this at any stage of the game, but I think one of the things with this is it's geared again to this point that every base is going to be a mega base in Space Age. And so having so much stuff moving around is going to get difficult to manage unless you get these extra tools. But of course, it's still massively beneficial for anyone. And if you're doing a regular vanilla mega base, having this informational tool is just going to be awesome as well. So next we see a video. This is on a platform, and the caption just says, a combinator bank selects a recipe for all the crushers and the display panel shows the current output. So this is basically doing sushi type belting. You've got a belt of all sorts of stuff rushing around these crushers, and this combinator bank, I assume, obviously don't know exactly what it's all set to, but basically it's doing some kind of math, some kind of processing, and using the new combinator, the one that again does the list sorting, picking the recipe for the crushers. The crushers are all connected on a green wire, which is going via the power pole here. Last week I said power poles weren't on platforms, but you can obviously use them still in order to pass signals around. You don't need them for power, but you do need them for sending red and green wire signals around, obviously, because it's just a little bit more tidy sometimes, I think. But basically this is the display panel then showing what recipe has been set. And there again you get into even more power, because this is setting a recipe and displaying the recipe. This is what the building is doing. It's not just icons of things in storage. It's, right, we'll crush iron, crush water, crush metallic asteroids, whatever you want it to do. This is then setting the recipe for those buildings, which is just awesome because it allows you to see what's happening, basically, which is the problem at the moment. You can probably do some of this via combinators already, but being able to just see, right, well, I've set these recipes to iron ore, I've set them, smelting iron ore, I've set them to crushing water asteroids or what have you, is going to be so useful. And in particular, one of the things that's going to be nice, and this is a weird side benefit, is I've always sort of said that alt mode's a little bit of a shame because it puts a whacking great icon over everything that you've built, and it's all lovely. I love the graphics, and I can't see the graphics a lot of the time because I've got alt mode on. But if you've got display that's showing you what the recipe is, that's showing you what's going on in these combinators and what's going on in these machines, then you don't need to have alt mode on as much, because you can just see this is my bank of crushers, and at the moment they are crushing iron, at the moment they are crushing water, and so you don't need that alt mode on as much. We use the display panels quite a bit in our office LAN parties. They are great in multiplayer where communication is key. Display panels will be coming for free as part of the base game 2.0 update. I think that one makes sense, why cut off access for players who don't buy the Space Age. I think, it's a sufficiently useful and sufficiently general feature that having this in the base game makes a lot of sense, And And in particular, even if you say, well, maybe they want to gate it and want to get you pay for it and what have you, you got to remember that Space Age is a mod and that there are other mods like Quality and the elevated rails where having this display functionality might actually be useful, particularly Quality, I'm thinking. And so if you limited it just to Space Age, how would you do that? Because it would then also have to be part of the Quality module and the elevated rails module, or a separate thing altogether, a separate mod itself, because otherwise, if you just wanted to play with Quality without Space Age, you wouldn't have display panels. So by putting it in the base game, you do. Inserter Pickup Fixes by Twinson. When playing with the new fastest transport belts, I noticed a problem. In some situations, even the fastest inserters were not able to pick up items from the belt. They would just about reach it, but miss it. A similar problem that was always in the game is burner inserters not being able to reliably pick up items from express transport belts. A problem which I personally found annoying and with no gameplay benefits. So on the left here, the caption basically just says, fast inserters not able to pick up from underground green transport belt. Video at 0.5 times speed. So it's a bit slowed down just so that you can see what's going on. And the key issue seems to be where the underground is. And my memory is that it's more reliable with the thing, because you do get this occasionally in the base game, with blue belts. And it seems like maybe the hood thing is a contributing factor. But basically this is behaviour that you will have seen a lot with burner inserters if you use them late game. And the caption on the second video just says, burner inserters not able to pick up from express transport belts, video at 0.5 times speed. So I had always assumed, and what it's going on to explain is that perhaps it wasn't intended behaviour, but I had always assumed this was intended behaviour, that the idea was that your burner inserters are just so slow and rubbish that they can't really pick things up off of express transport belts. The only way they can is when it gets the backup thing, when it starts to back up a bit and they start to slow down, then it can start grabbing them. But it sounds like maybe that wasn't quite intended behaviour. Looking at them in slow motion, especially in the burner inserter example, it looks like the hand reaches the items just fine, so it should just pick it up if it's close enough. Implementing some simple snapping should fix both issues. As usual, it was not that simple. So I'm going to just zoom in on that video basically to show you what the point was. And in particular, if you look at this one in the middle, that's kind of the best example, you can kind of see that it kind of gets close to the coal. It's just not quite able to get it for some reason. And it does look weird, and it does look like it should be able to grab the thing. So yeah, it does, when you slow it down and you actually look at it, it is a bit sort of like, I'd always sort of assumed it wouldn't even get it, the problem, it wasn't even getting there, it wasn't able to turn fast enough to get to the item, and so it just whipped past without it getting it. But it does look like it does actually, get to the item, but isn't able to pick it up for some reason. And Twinson's thought was, right, well, I'll just add a little bit of tweak to the snapping, so when it gets to the item, it snaps to it rather than having to exactly match it, which is obviously a little bit of a cheat that they do. But inserters have two independent movement speeds. Rotation speed, which is how fast the arm spins on its base, and extension speed, which is how fast the hand extends and retracts. So after some debugging, it turned out that the extension speed was just too slow. The arm would rotate to the correct angle, which is what we saw, but the hand would take its sweet time to reach the correct length. So buffing this value for the inserters helped. I also improved the snapping logic, so inserters will snap better to the item when it's close enough. So basically we see this in play here, and the basic idea is that it was able to swing round, as we saw, to get to the item, but then it does another bit where it extends the arm, and the arm just reaches out and grabs the item. And they also, as I say, have a bit of a snap on that, so that if it's close enough, then it will just snap to where it actually needs to be to pick up the item. And it appears that it was that bit where it reaches out that was just slightly too slow. So then if we look at these two videos here side by sides, we can see that now both the long-handed inserters, the blue inserters, and the coal burners are able to pick up from green and blue belt. I don't know whether that means burner inserters will be able to pick up from express belt, the very fastest belt. I don't know if that is going to just be the step that's too far from them, and that is maybe the intended behaviour. But it's interesting that it shows it with the blue belt rather than the green belt for the burner inserters. With the changes, both issues are fixed. Inserters are now more consistent, less prone to frustrating failures, and it also gives them a small buff when taking from transport belts. Which is actually kind of a good thing, because inserters are actually like the big UPS hog, because they do actually pick up from the belt, is one of the things. You could like kind of fake it, where it just swings to the right position and then suddenly it's in the hand and it swings around. But they do actually like chase items on a belt. So when you can actually see it, like in these examples where they're actually sort of moving around and jiggling to try and get the item. They have a prediction thing, okay, where it basically says this is where the item is going to be when you reach it. Okay, if you swing now, your head and the item will coincide. But they then do a chasing where basically they try and grab the item, okay? And that calculation is dynamic anyway. And so the point is, as I said, that it could do the swing, but then it would get there and the grab wasn't right. So I'm actually wondering if maybe part of the thing was that prediction algorithm didn't factor in the extension, basically, because otherwise it would start the arm swinging a bit earlier. As always, display your thoughts at the usual places. In terms of overall reaction, this is great. As I was enthusing during the read of the Friday Facts, I'm very enthusiastic for the changes that are coming to the circuit network, because to me, from what I'm reading, it's going to make it a bit more like normal programming without having to do too much things that are bespoke to Factorio to work around the simplifications that they've put in. And this is just another example. To me, this is getting into the territory of things like, like putting breakpoints in code and being able to see what values variables have and things like that. You're getting into quite a lot of nice little detail that will improve how I'm able to interact with the circuit network without too much faffing around. And as I say, that's that step that's really my problem. I love the design of the display thing. I think it's really, really great. Lovely to see that cathode ray tube style, and it does fit really well with the aesthetic of the game. The inserters thing is just a nice little buff, really, isn't it? As I say, I thought that the burner inserters not being able to grab from blue belt was kind of intended behaviour, and I suspect maybe it was, and that's why the grab speed was so low, so that they couldn't grab. But as Twinson says, I don't know that that's really useful in a sense. It just makes it so that at some point you have to upgrade your burner inserters that you put in at the beginning of the game or up to yellow, and in fact I'm not sure yellow ones are very reliable grabbing from blue belt, so I would usually put them up to fast inserters. But it's just a nice little tweak that means that there's one less pain point, I guess. So yeah, really, really happy with this. It's obviously not the most spectacular of Friday Facts and is very much in the weeds of like a small buff and an improvement that will help people with circuit networks, but I don't know that this is like game-changing stuff. I guess the other one that's worth just picking up is that I don't think there's anything new here. It was a little difficult to tell. This is quite this is zoomed in 150%, and it's already pixely, so I don't know what's going on here. The only things I thought might be something new were the thing on the left here, which I think is actually flying robot frames. I think that's what that is, looking at it, but it was quite difficult to kind of tell. If I zoom right in, that was my best guess for what these are. They sort of feel like they've got that fan on the top, but it could be something new. The other one that, this is more it isn't different thing, basically, which is the artillery. I think this is kind of confirming that the artillery recipe is the same, because you've got your explosive shells here, and those appear to be using explosives and steel and plastic, as you kind of expect them to be, explosive shells, and then your artillery uses them, plus radars, and is it iron plate it uses? But I think that's confirming that the recipe for artillery is unchanged. That's relevant because I've been speculating that maybe... that explosives is unchanged, because I had a speculation that maybe explosive recipe was changed, but this appears just to be coal, sulfur, water, equals explosive. So I don't think there's any change to the basic explosives. Whether we get some super explosive, a super artillery shell, something like that is still open, I think. But I think that's just confirming that there's no real changes to artillery. Of course, they could be playing on a vanilla base and it changes for space age, but I don't think that would be the case. The next one was a little bit, how to phrase it, not a thing, but implication of a thing. Basically, in this base, when you look at this here, this is them producing, this is barrel plant, yeah? And they are producing, clearly, in significant scale, barrels. Now, since the introduction of fluid wagons, barrels have sort of become redundant. They're obviously used in cliff explosive, so this could be mass production of cliff explosives. That's one sensible possibility. But it's a bit weird to set up like mass production of barrels. How much cliff explosive do you really need? Obviously, we know we've got a lot of cliffs on Volcanus, and if the plateaus are cliffs on Fulgora, then we've also seen cliffs on Gleba, so maybe cliff explosives becomes something worth scale automating. But it's just interesting that barrels are being mass produced, because typically fluids nowadays you would send around via fluid wagons, so why make loads and loads of barrels? One possibility, of course, is that some fluid, e.g. water, oil, something like that, is worth sending around your system, because I don't believe liquid fluids will be transportable via space platform. So I've just been assuming that they would give us some way of making oil products and getting water on every planet, even if it was a bit of a pain or involved lots of steps. You would basically be able to make the various liquids locally or extract them or what have you. I'm wondering if Aquilo basically requires fluids to be imported, and that's one of the reasons it's a end game planet, because you would need to be making something like barrels and handling the barrels, so either sending them back to the planet that they're being filled on, or recycling them or something like that, because barrels are very space inefficient. You cannot put a lot of fluid in a barrel, and you cannot stack barrels very high. So sending them round your system, meaning the planetary system, would seem to be quite inefficient, and that really you would want to be doing everything locally. But of course, if you can't get water at all, for example, on Aquilo, or you can't get oil, or maybe you can only get petroleum on Aquilo, something like that, sending barrels of the material, of the fluid, would make some sense. I hope that that's just me being paranoid and we don't have to do that, because managing transport of fluids via barrel before we had fluid wagons was horrendous. It was always an absolute pain, and I'm finding it to be an absolute pain in space exploration. I've just got so many barrels and therefore so much steel where I don't want it. It's an absolute pain in the bum. So I'm hoping that's just me being a bit paranoid, and this isn't everyone's going to have to build 1 million barrels. Oh, the other thing I wanted to point out, and I don't know that this is really anything, but they don't appear to explain like the functionality, because you've got the ability to directly put an icon on, great, but this also appears to have the little symbol for adding pictures on. So I'm wondering if you can also put pictures into the into the text field, basically, so you could have multiple things. I'm wondering how easy that would be in a sense, because you'd have to keep adding them individually, I think. I know, I think you can use some sort of equivalent to Unicode and put images in no matter what. But it was just interesting to see on the thing, the display panel, you've got both the icon, because it's very similar then to the tagging. You've got the actual icon, but you can also, I think, put actual images into the text that you put on, which is going to be quite useful as well, I think. The last couple of bits are on the EMP recipe. Last week for the Friday Facts, we got sort of some confirmation, I think, of maybe what might be the final assets. From what was being said on Reddit, I suspect actually they were placeholders, and maybe there's still some to be done. But basically, what I wanted to point out for the first one was essentially that we see the holmium plate again. So I don't know if this is now final or, it's still work in progress, but this does appear to be the Holmium plate, so that looks like that is definitely a thing. But more generally, these EMPs seem to be making what I think are the supercapacitors. Basically, on the belt, we've got batteries, plastic, Holmium plate, and the blue wire. Okay, if the blue wire is the superconducting wire, superconductors, or however it's phrased, then it would appear that the recipe for, there it is, for what I believe to be the supercapacitors is a battery, a plastic bar, a Holmium plate, and a blue wire, because they seem to put everything in, basically, in order to make one of those. Obviously, can't quite tell the recipes. I'm not sufficiently clued in on what's going on there, but basically it looks like the supercapacitor is essentially a giant battery. It's a superconducting version of a battery. So it takes a battery and improves it with plastic, Holmium plate, and what I assume is the superconducting wire. What then does that imply for its usage? I have wondered whether we are going to get kind of a supercapacitor in the sense of an actual building, that there's going to be a level 2 capacitor. The other bit that's also implied in this, and we can't see fluid flowing, is that they do appear to be connected to a fluid thing as well without an output. So it could of course be that there is a byproduct, that you have to manage, that is a fluid that comes out when you make the supercapacitors. But I'm assuming that actually we do need to put in a fluid as well. We saw, I can't remember what it's called, we did see that there is like a pink fluid. And I think we have actually seen this recipe before, but yeah, it's nice to get a confirmation of that's how it's going to work. I don't know if we have seen these icons before, but it looks like they're pretty much final to me. These look pretty good. I do wonder if maybe the Holmium plate is a little bit work in progress still, and we might get a different one of those. But yeah, I'm guessing that this is the blue wire, and this is the supercapacitor. Where is it? It's gone. There it is. And so that's that recipe for that. I hope you enjoyed today's Friday Facts video and might consider coming back for another one. If you'd like to chat about the latest Factorio Friday Facts, you can find me live streaming Factorio every weekend over on my Twitch channel at Trismegistus. Thanks for watching. Cheers. Next point of peculation.